Hi, my name is Joe. I joined TWA in 1972 and stayed 34 years. I spent some of that time as a flight attendant, and then I moved to in-flight services, helping to train new flight attendants to fill our ranks. Today, I volunteer as an assistant in our museum's library and archives. I look back on my TWA career with great pride, and I am pleased to be with you today to share the story of TWA's flight attendants in the 1970s. 1970 was a very significant year for TWA and its flight attendants, starting with the introduction of the great Boeing 747 widebody. Now, up to 14 flight attendants worked as a large, highly coordinated team capable of providing cabin service to over 400 passengers. In addition to the 747, something else significant happened in 1970. TWA said goodbye to the title of hostess and replaced it with cabin or flight attendant. As times were changing for women in American culture, flight attendants saw the roles and the scope of their careers changing as well. In addition to the title change, more sensible rules would be introduced in areas such as marriage, pregnancy, and age. Meanwhile, TWA flight attendant uniforms continued to change not only in style, but in material. Starting in 1935, TWA hostess uniforms were made of fabrics such as wool and gabardine. It was now the 1970s, and flight attendants expressed the need to have uniforms made of materials that were easier to care for. In 1971, TWA called on Italian fashion designer Valentino to deliver that purple uniform on your left. In addition to being fashionable, it was practical, as it was made of a polyester blend that could be washed and even hung to dry overnight. A huge convenience, especially when away from home. The idea of choice in style and color was also carried forward to this new line of more classically colored uniforms. The purple one on display was one of 3 colors available and allowed several mix and match combinations. Just above the left shoulder is a photograph showing various appearances. The Valentino uniforms also provided some firsts for TWA flight attendants. One of those was the option to wear slacks. There were even shorts that could be worn, known as hot pants. They were worn with a dress that could be buttoned down to the waist, revealing just a hint of that fashion craze, which, by the way, did not last very long. You also may notice something missing for the first time: a hat. Some flight attendants used the brown or purple scarves as fashionable headbands. However, the days of the mandatory flight attendant hat dating back to 1935 were over. On to 1974, when new uniforms were issued to coordinate a look for women and men. Yes, men. In 1972, TWA hired its first male flight attendants. In actuality, this was not the first time men had served passengers on board TWA airplanes. If you visited the first stop in this display case, you'll recall men, known as couriers, first served passengers on TWA's predecessor airline, Transcontinental Air Transport. Then, in 1946, men were hired to be pursers on board TWA's international flights. It was the spring of 1972, however, that saw the first males join the ranks of TWA's flight attendants. 20 of us entered training back then. I emphasize the word us because I was among those first 20. Since Valentino's uniforms, issued a year earlier, did not include a male version, TWA provided us with dark suits similar to those worn by the cockpit crew. It had 1 stripe on each sleeve. 2 years later, in 1974, Stan Herman designed coordinated uniforms for men and women. For us, that consisted of that dark brown jacket in the center. Our ability to vary our appearance was somewhat limited to slacks that either matched the jacket or were beige. While we stuck to shades of brown, our female counterparts had a wider color palette to choose from. The color of that uniform to your left was called brick. There were also colors of gold and royal blue available to our female co-workers. All of the bright colors and variety of the 1960s and 70s would come to an end in 1978 when Ralph Lauren designed a new uniform that was similar in style for men and women. It's the last uniform on the right, and you can clearly see a transition to a more professional appearance, not unlike the first 1938 uniform we displayed at the first stop in this exhibit. I think we can conclude that things did come full circle. By the way, the Lauren uniform you're looking at was a summer version. In the early 1980s, the summer version was discontinued and the dark navy blue winter uniform was worn year-round. On the sidewall is a picture of one of my former co-workers wearing that uniform. The Lauren uniform and a similar one issued in 2000 would be the final ones worn by TWA flight attendants. There has certainly been a lot that we have covered. Before you move on, I'd like to mention a couple of other items in this section. The Asian-themed meal service items at the bottom in front of the purple and yellow uniforms to your left were used in conjunction with TWA's Asian and Around the World service. TWA actually had a long history of service to Asia, beginning with flights to Bombay, India back in 1947. Those flights went from and to the U.S. via the Atlantic Ocean. In 1966, TWA extended its Asian service to the Chinese mainland, flying to Hong Kong, also via the Atlantic. A big milestone occurred in 1969 when TWA was granted authority to fly between the U.S. and Asia via the Pacific Ocean as well, making TWA an around-the-world airline. Heading back to the U.S. from Asia, TWA's Trans-Pacific flights made their first U.S. stop in Hawaii before continuing on to the mainland at Los Angeles. A dramatic rise in the price of crude oil and a slowing world economy caused this route to be a financial drain on the company. In 1975, TWA ended its Trans-Pacific service and its claim of being an around-the-world airline, a short but very significant piece of TWA's history. Finally, there's a picture we'd like to tell you about. It's the photograph of the two ladies below the purple Valentino uniform. That's mother and daughter Wanda Moore and Kathy Grant. Wanda was a TWA hostess from 1947 to 1949. Kathy flew for TWA from 1972 to 1977, fulfilling her childhood dream of following in her mom's footsteps. They were part of the TWA family, in more ways than one. Wanda married James L. Moore, who eventually retired from TWA as a Director of Operations Control, and Kathy's husband, Bob Grant, flew for TWA as a captain and also worked in pilot training. Wanda and Kathy are two of the thousands of men and women who, as hostesses and flight attendants, were the faces of TWA, representing the airline to millions of passengers around the world for over 65 years. I hope you have enjoyed learning about the great history of this extraordinary group of TWA employees.